It's been over a decade since I studied English at the University of Oxford, and in that time I have learnt so much that were I to go back and do it all again, I would have a completely different, better, more positive, more rewarding, richly rewarding experience. So I'm thinking of doing a series where I'm going to break down each of the term times for studying an English degree, an undergraduate degree. We're going to follow the Oxford scheme for English language and literature. So we've got Michaelmas, that's in the autumn, sort of like December time, end of the year. Then we've got Hilary, second term, and then we've got Trinity. And I'm going to break it down if there's call for it. So if you like this sort of thing, please show some love and hit the like and subscribe button. But basically I'm going to go through each term and each year. So first year, first term, first year, second term, first year, third term, second year, third year, and so on. And basically this is what I would do and what I would recommend to new English students enrolling for the first time, whether you're going to Oxford, Cambridge, or any university really. Like I said, we're going to follow the syllabus that I followed during my first year and first term of Oxford, but feel free to adapt it. The first year syllabus basically looks like Victorians, modernism, and old sort of Middle English, but mainly Old English. There's also a module called Paper 1, which is critical theory, theory of language, theory of literature, where you learn how to look at literature through different prisms and different ideologies and stuff like that. Now, one of the first things that I would do, and this begins before you even go to university for the first time, before your first term even begins, and that is twofold. One, read as much as you possibly can on your vacation reading list, the preparatory reading list. They're gonna burden you with these big old reading lists, bloated with books. Don't do what I and many of my peers did when we first enrolled and try to not read that many books. Try to read the smaller books and try to get through them. We didn't read that many books before we came, and that was a real hindrance. But twofold, sort of twinned piece of advice is learn to read properly. And that sounds ludicrous. It sounds like, well, I already know how to read. I'm studying English at the University of Oxford. Trust me, I have not personally. I didn't learn to read properly until perhaps only 3, maybe 2 years ago, properly. Proper reading is really involved. Now, there are some things you can do, some shortcuts and some hacks to get you there. Some things that you can't really do and you can't shortcut, but a quick shortcut is to read certain books, like How to Read by Mortimer Adler. That will teach you the different levels of reading: inspectional reading, observational reading, analytical reading, how to do synoptical reading. Now, synoptical reading is really difficult. We're going to talk about this in my own How to Read video course. So if you're interested in that, sign up to the VIP waiting list and you'll be notified when you can enroll. But basically, synoptical reading is the power of bringing your experience to bear upon the works. This is really, really difficult. It's integrating everything you know about the world, psychology, yourself, other people, and bringing it to the texts, and then also sort of scaffolding the books onto other books and sort of deep diving and spiraling off into different authors and themes. There's a real art to this. But anyway, get How to Read a Book by Mortimer Adler. Also get How to Read and Why by Harold Bloom, and you might also want to get his Western canon or Shakespeare, The Invention of the Human, but definitely How to Read or How to Read and Why. Why do you want to get that? That's less practical than Adler's book. Adler's book is practical, immediately applicable, shows you techniques for immediately digesting the books in a correct way. Hard books, difficult books, books that are over your head. Whereas Bloom's gets to the heart of why we read, and it's very, very poetic. He talks about how to achieve Readers Sublime, which is like runner's high, basically. That's when you're in flow state when you're reading, and you get all these sort of crystallizing ideas, and you get a sublimity wash over you. So read Harold Bloom. You might also want to read The ABC of Reading by Ezra Pound, and those should get you started. But definitely read as much as you can on the recommended reading lists. If you're going to study English, you really should get into the groove of making reading your life as soon as possible. If a big old reading list fills you with dread rather than excitement, you're either going to have to reevaluate your subject and your decision for studying it, or you're going to have to try and change your passion and try to align your future vision, align your identity and your personality and who you are as a person with this idea of reading, self-study, exploration, curiosity, learning, art, aesthetics, all that stuff. You need to get to the core of why this sort of thing is so important. And we can talk about that another day. In fact, I think we will. But definitely do some exploration and try and figure out what you like, why you like it, and also try to figure out what you don't like, what you're resistant to, and keep asking yourself why. Keep asking yourself clarifying questions, why you don't like certain things. Why are certain things important, but you don't like them? Why are certain things not important, but you do like them? Now, this leads on to my next tip, which is alongside the reading. Make sure you continue to indulge your own loves, your own literary loves. The tragedy for me was before I went to Oxford, I was really interested in world literature, particularly philosophy. I liked the works of Friedrich Nietzsche, I liked Japanese literature, I liked works from all over, basically France, Germany, Russia, but obviously the clue is in the name, English language and literature. These texts they're not really studied in English language and literature. It's about the English canon, which, unfortunately, apart from Shakespeare, I didn't find much to grip me. I studied the Beat Generation for my dissertation, I studied Joseph Conrad, but even today I wouldn't go back to them. I continuously go back to Shakespeare. I'm currently reading him in chronological order, and I'm loving it. He's my favourite author. But aside from him, a lot of the works and the modules were a bit of a slog because I didn't instinctively connect with them. I don't instinctively connect with Spencer or Milton. It takes a lot of work and deep digging to find out why you should read these. But whilst you're reading everything you should read and also trying to learn to love them and figure out why they're so good, continue to indulge your true loves, because what happened to me was I got burnt out. By the end of the 3 years, I'd read so many books that I didn't connect with that I never wanted to see another book again, and I went about a year or two without seeing a single book, and then I picked up some Japanese literature and that got me back into it, and it got me into a deep reading program, a self-study deep reading program that was deeper than Oxford, that I am still in today, and that I will continue for the rest of my life. So you want to commit to the reading, and you also want to commit to a sort of meta learning. Basically learn how to learn. This is really important. This is the difference between people who go to the library for 10 hours and study for 10 hours and leave in tears having not remembered anything, and elite level students who pull firsts easily, go to the library for 2 hours, 3 hours top, and leave cool as a cucumber, and the rest of the day is theirs. There is an art to effective study. I have a free course, you can check it out in the link below, for effective study techniques. You might want to check that out. Basically, it all comes down to planning. So make sure you learn how to plan effectively. You want to have a whole planning day at least once a week. The smallest unit of time for planning is the day, but you don't want to plan as the days come up. You don't want to just wing it. You don't want to wake up on Monday and think, oh, what do I have to do today? No, every Sunday you want to take an hour, maybe even longer. Measure twice, cut once. Go get a nice coffee, get a nice planner that you want to use, maybe even a wall calendar, and figure out your goals. Now, your goals for the week will be based on your goals for the month, which will be based on your goals for the term. If you're in Oxford or another university and you're studying English, this will usually be in-house exams like collections. You'll be studying for them. So set up your weeks to fulfill that criteria. And obviously each week you're going to have an essay. In Oxford we had 2 or 3 per week. It was pretty full on. If you don't study and you leave it to chance, you won't get very far, you won't do very well, you'll flounder, you'll get overwhelmed. And a lot of people do get overwhelmed in Oxford. Oh, how much could be saved, how much stress and anxiety and heartache and low scores could be completely avoided if people just simply knew how to study effectively. And another thing you want to do, in addition to studying effectively, is learn how to write an essay effectively. Don't be like me and many other students. It took me 2.5 years before I learned how to write first-class essays. Sure, I got a few firsts in my first year. I even got a top score in my collections, the in-house exams, and they actually gave me an award a few times. I got the complete works of Shakespeare and the complete works of Chaucer hardbound with a gold Oriel College crest and my name. I'm quite proud of those. But it took me a while, and it took me being mentored consistently on a weekly basis by a PhD mentor, a PhD student, to actually crack the code of what makes an effective essay. And the thing is, this is what I've got a real problem with universities. Everything is pinned on your essays or your problem sheets, but they don't actually go a bit meta and say, right, this is how you do an essay. Like, if I was running a university, I would say, right, week 1, this is how you write a thesis statement. Week 2, this is how you research. Week 3, this is how you find effective or interesting primary and secondary sources. Week 4, we're going to look at how to write an effective paragraph, how to create cohesion between paragraphs, talk about formatting, bibliographies, conclusions, all that good stuff, and just general lifestyle practices, supplements, aligning your sleep-wake cycles, all that sort of thing. But they don't do that at university. That's why I've got another course called How to Write a First-Class Essay. There's a link in the description below. Learn how to write an essay as soon as possible. Do as much reading as soon as possible, and get used to reading, and get used to writing, and get used to speaking about books. Now obviously I've mentioned that an effective study technique would be just a couple of hours in a day. This is the same for essay writing, but the most effective reading schedule is to read as much as possible, to actually get fatigue. If you can read until you start to shake, and this is not medical advice, but if you can read until you get actually bodily fatigued, to the point where you stand up and start to get dizzy, then you know how far you can push yourself. You can do that a couple of times, and that's good. You want to take advantage of that while you're young, because there's a difference between fluid knowledge or intelligence and crystallized intelligence. Before the age of 25, your brain is still forming. So essentially what you need to do is fill it with as much stuff as possible, because your older brain that consolidates that information and brings life experience to it and makes it more robust and more mature will thank you for it. There's lessons I've learned when I was a teenager that I've only truly understood the principle of them after experience many, many years later. So you want to cram your head with as much as possible. And while you're doing all that reading, you want to keep yourself in good shape. Remember that the body and mind are intertwined, and you can actually hack your academic potential and get better grades by supplementing correctly, having a good diet, and exercising correctly. You want to be doing cardiovascular activity pretty much every day. If you stack it right before a study session, you'll be more effective, you'll be more calm, less anxiety, you'll have better retention for what you need to learn. 20 minutes is a minimum, but 40 minutes is good. Weightlifting is also good. We can talk about this at length another time if you're interested. You want to create an effective fitness regimen that will support your academic career. Part of this fitness regimen includes stretching and posture exercises, flexibility training. As a student, as an academic, as a scholar, you'll be sitting long hours, unfortunately, unless you have a standing desk. And even those standing desks can put a bit too much strain on your neck, your shoulders, your lower back, everything really. You want to keep yourself healthy. Now, we love reading, we love learning, we love writing about things that interest us, so we want to be able to do it as long as possible. Remember, you are not a scholar for 3 years or however long your degree lasts. This is a lifelong pursuit. So you want to look after your body and your brain at the same time, because this is all you have really. Okay, you have the soul as well, and you're going to bring the soul to the work, but you need to take care of the casing which holds it. Now, another thing I want to recommend to you, and this is a bit of a hack, is to adopt some critical parents. What does that mean? Well, when I was learning Japanese, I adopted a Japanese language father. Basically, this was a person who I wanted to sound like. You can sound more native, and you can get to, well, conversational, almost native fluency quite quickly if you just nail pronunciation, for example. You nail idioms, turns of phrase, slang. If you hear and mimic the lilt and sway of a certain person, a real person's speech, that's a really good thing. So what I did was I shadowed specific people, I recorded myself shadowing, and I listened back to my recordings next to the natives' recordings, and I isolated where I was making mistakes and tried to correct the mistakes. You can do something similar by adopting a critical parent. Find a critic that speaks to you personally, that sort of hits all your buttons, and read as much as you can by that person. My favourite critic at the moment is Harold Bloom. I also have a penchant for Colin Wilson. Some people might like authors like Virginia Woolf. Some people might like Vladimir Nabokov. I don't know who you'll like. I like Bloom and Wilson, as I said. I also like Mortimer Adler. Find someone who you kind of want to learn from, be the disciple of. Okay, so that's a good hack as well, and it will introduce you to new ideas that you hadn't thought of before and might be challenging, and then you can expand outwards. Do that as quickly as possible, because finding the right mentor will be a shortcut. It's a guiding light through the darkness, and it's a very good thing to do early on. I also recommend that you err on the side of early. That means try to get your work done as early as possible. Don't be one of those people floundering and running about like headless chickens and going to the library at midnight to cram and do an all-nighter. Take the pressure off yourself and get there early. That is a good piece of advice that will set you up and take the pressure off you a little bit. It will give you more wiggle room for things to go wrong. I also recommend that you go to as many lectures as possible, print off the lecture list and circle the ones that are interesting, circle at least 10 per term, circle ones that you absolutely want nothing to do with, and then consider going to those as well, because strong negative reactions can sometimes lead to some of the biggest sort of realizations. I also recommend that you find hook holds onto other topics, other authors and other ideas, like the footnote follow-up. When you're reading different authors, look at the bibliography, look at the footnotes, look at who those authors were influenced by, and go down a rabbit hole. You want to be T-shaped. Basically, you want a really broad knowledge across the whole spectrum, across the whole of English history, and then you want to go deep on the areas that really interest you. Try to scale your reading as much as possible. My biggest regret about university is that I was not writing publicly at that time. I should have been putting out book reviews whilst I was at university, doing videos on the books that I love, doing podcasts. I've got a podcast now, but I should have been doing it whilst I was learning, and then building a community and building a bit of a business, a bit of a fan base. And just, if you're scaling what you're reading and scaling what you're writing, if you're putting out your opinions into the world, you have more social consequence and you have more feedback points, more people telling you what you've done well and what you've done badly, more people giving you ideas of different directions to pursue. And while you're doing all this reading, try to possess by memory. If you memorize, for example, a poem, you'll find that by possessing it by memory, it possesses you. Memorization is a lost art, it's a lost technique. We can talk about this, and I think we will in one of these videos, but try as much as possible to retain that which interests you, because if you keep it in your mind, you can consult it at any point and you can introduce it to other life experiences along the way. This is synoptic reading. Talking about experience, try to always connect everything with what you love. Now, Oxford tells you that you can have your studies. There are three things. There are studies, friends and extracurriculars, and you can only pick two. I think try to do extracurriculars. If there is a newspaper, write for the newspaper. I wrote for Oxford's newspaper. If there is a student radio show, go on the student radio show. Try to give yourself a lot of touch points to different industries, because you're always trying to find the direction you're going in. Not anyone knows what they want to do with their life, especially not at university. Maybe you want to go into theatre or film or journalism or write novels, whatever it is, but give yourself lots of opportunities to explore. Experience is what brings out the meaning in these books, so make sure you have lots of experiences. Have heartaches and loves and betrayals, have arguments, change your mind, be introduced to different ideas. Make sure you experience and think and constantly flesh out your ideas, speaking and writing. So you want to be writing reams and reams and stuff. You want to be talking and debating. You want to be thinking all of the time and reading as much as possible. Ultimately, you want to find a way to pierce to the heart of enjoyment. You don't want to just pass an exam. You don't want to tick things off a list. You want to relish every part of the process as much as possible, and try to love as much as possible, and try to figure out why what you're doing is so important, why it's meaningful. Anyway, let's talk about the first term. This was my first term, the reading for Oxford University. This is Michaelmas, first term, first year. Let's look at how I might approach the Victorians, Old English, modernism. Right, let's have a little chat about where to start. What are you going to be doing going into your first year? Okay, so the first thing you want to do, make a list of your critical parents. I would recommend 3 potentials. Read around and try to find names that come up over and over again. For example, if you're big into Shakespeare, you'll see a fellow called Wilson Knight come up quite a lot. You'll see, Hazlitt, yeah. You'll see Johnson. You'll see Harold Bloom. Okay. Who else will you see if you like Shakespeare? A.C. Bradley, particularly in regards to tragedy. So that's just Shakespeare alone. But for me, one of my critical parents is 100% Harold Bloom. And I'd read things like Shakespeare, The Invention of the Human. I would read the Western Canon. I would read How to Read and Why. And if you want a real challenge, I'd read The Anxiety of Influence. This is Bloom's theory. Basically, every poet writing is contributing to a grander, everlasting one poem, and basically they always have influence. For example, Shakespeare was influenced by Marlowe, and they need to respond to their influence either by denying completely and pivoting in a completely different direction, or by adding something that they don't feel that their predecessor, their teacher, who they've learned from, hasn't gone far enough. So, like I said, for Shakespeare, Marlowe, Ovid, maybe Chaucer, maybe the Bible, Holinshed's histories. The Anxiety of Influence, I think he's got one called The Anatomy of Influence. I think that's what it's called. I'm reading that at the moment. That's really good. So I would go to Harold Bloom. Who else? I like Colin Wilson, as I mentioned. Colin Wilson wrote The Outsider, which is great if you're reading like Dostoevsky. Who else does he talk about? William James, the psychologist, he talks about Yeats, the poet, plenty really. He's also got a great book called The Craft of the Novel. Really, really insightful. I'd actually call that a must before going and studying English. It's a really good book, and it will place a lot. It'll make things make a lot of sense. He's also got a book called The Strength to Dream. He talks about people like Tolkien, who actually, if you go to Oxford, you'll learn Old English and Middle English in the lecture halls where Tolkien lectured. You might even go to the pubs where he would read out bits of The Lord of the Rings before it was published to people like C.S. Lewis. You can walk down the same streets. It's pretty cool. So I'd pick Colin Wilson. A third one, for me, it would have to be Mortimer Adler. His book, what's it called? Yeah, How to Read a Book. I should remember that because it's pretty straightforward. How to Read a Book. He's got a book called Aristotle for Everybody. Aristotle's great. Anyway, you fill it in. Try and find 3 people where you can just read their stuff. You don't have to take things as like point blank. In fact, it's good if you don't, but have some sort of touchstone. It will make things a lot easier. And then, okay, the self-chosen books. All right, if you've done the English interview, chances are you got asked to talk about 7 books, and they would have said, are they self-chosen or school reading or whatever? And you probably should have chosen all of them yourself. But what I would say is the books that you talked about in interview, you've obviously picked them because you like them. These are books where you're going to go deeper. All right. So for me, I chose, for example, Faulkner's As I Lay Dying. How do I go deeper from there? Well, I could read Absalom. I could read The Sound and the Fury. I could figure out what the Faulknerian tradition is. Who has he influenced? Then you're reading Toni Morrison, Song of Solomon, Beloved, jazz, all that stuff. You could read A Good Man Is Hard to Find, short story. The name now of the author eludes me, which is a shame. But you could also see his opposite, or who he was sort of pitted against in literary history. That's Hemingway. Basically, do more. Learn more, all right? For example, a lot of people, they talk about Lolita, Nabokov's Lolita at interview. That's a really popular one. Go find out more. Nabokov has an autobiography where he outlays his theories of aesthetics. Really interesting. He's got synesthesia, so you can like smell colours and see sounds. Or you could see his lectures. He's got lectures on Russian history, literature. He talks about Tolstoy, talks about Dostoevsky, Gogol, Turgenev. That's really interesting. Or read some of his other novels. He's got some really interesting one, like he's got Pale Flyer, which is like a poem, but it's kind of like a puzzle. So you'd go into that a bit more. One that I discussed in interview was Nietzsche's The Birth of Tragedy. Basically, how can I go deeper on that? I can either segue into other works by Nietzsche, or see who he was influenced by, or see who he influenced, or I can return to this, pick a bit that resonated with me specifically. For me, it was this idea of Apollonian Dionysian duality. Okay, well, that's basically the whole book, but rinse it. You can rip those pages out, reread them, pull them apart. If you like Gatsby, read that conclusion again and pick it apart, memorize it even. What else could you do? Well, you get the idea. And then here's another thing you can do. This is an interview strategy, but this is good for going to your first term. What ideas or parts from books are you most keen to discuss? Try to list 10 potentials. So come up with ideas. Like if you've read Dracula or you've read Shirley Jackson's stuff, then you're probably interested in Gothic literature. So put that down, put Gothic down. And then you're going to figure out what Gothic means. and you're going to go down that rabbit hole. Or maybe you're interested in, I don't know, symbolism. Yeah, you've read Oscar Wilde and you want to go down that rabbit hole. Start listing stuff out. I say 10 because it's sometimes hard to make lists of 10. The reason why you want 10 is because then you can go down and pick like 80-20 rule. So like out of a list of 10, only 2, maybe 3 are going to be really good and rich areas to explore. The rest are like fodder. They're just there to enable the good ideas. It's like Ray Bradbury's advice. He says to write 1 short story a week. That's 52 a year. He says it's impossible to write 52 bad short stories in a row. So, yeah, more the merrier. So then you go and you circle 2 or 3 of those ideas and then try to spiral off, listing more related topics that you could keep deep diving into. So, for example, if you've gone through and you think, all right, out of all these, I really like the Gothic, then go down and say, where am I going to go next for the Gothic? It could be authors, it could be sub-ideas, it could be ages. There's the Southern Gothic over in America. Whatever, you get the idea. Another thing you can do is, learn to love questions. This is a piece of advice from Rilke. He wrote this to a young poet was asking him advice. What should I do to be a better poet? And he was telling him, learn to love the questions. Questions are more important than answers. Here are some example questions. What is art? What is great literature? Ezra Pound thought that great literature was simply language charged with meaning to the utmost possible degree. That's interesting. So how do you charge language with meaning to the utmost possible degree? There's 3 primary ways. Pound thought melopea, or melody, phanopea, visual imagery, throw in an image on the mind's eye, and logopea, kind of how you say things, metaphors, all that sort of thing. The Greeks were the best at melopea. The languages that use Chinese characters were the best at phanopea, and perhaps English is the best at logopea. We can debate this. Another great question is, who should be included in the canon? That can be a controversial one sometimes. Another great question is, what is realism? Just having the questions that you would like answers to, is a great start, because you don't need to know the answers, you just need to know what questions you want the answers to. Why? Because when you get into tutorial, if you haven't got anything to say, you can just pose questions, let other people unpick it, start a debate. The tutors are really knowledgeable, they're top 0.01% in the world. Ask them these questions and you'll get insightful answers, or they'll take you down a path, Socratic dialogue style, in which you can eventually become enlightened by asking you questions. So that's a good thing to do. Now let's look at some different books and places and ideas to go. So we talked about mindset stuff and how to approach your studies, but let's talk about specific subject advice. Now, obviously, first term, I'm working from a syllabus that starts with Old English, goes through the Victorians and modernism. Modernism is basically anything up to the present day, although after 1965 it's probably more like postmodernism, but we'll include everything. Now, my first piece of advice is to get started on Chaucer right away. Get yourself the Riverside Chaucer. Now, why do you need to get started on Chaucer when you might not even do Chaucer until your 2nd year? You need to get started on Chaucer because you need to learn to love Chaucer as early as possible. I hated Chaucer because I didn't understand him, I didn't get him, I found him difficult, I found the whole Middle English, English Renaissance, Old English, I found it quite difficult to get my head around. I didn't know enough about it. You need to love Chaucer and get to know Chaucer and see why he's so important, because if you don't get Chaucer, you don't fully get Shakespeare, and if you don't fully get Shakespeare, you don't really get anything. Now, obviously, Chaucer was influenced by his romances and his lays and the Breton lays and, the old Italian books and French books. Fine. But it all really does kick off with Chaucer. Yes, you'll look at Beowulf, you'll look at Gawain, you'll look at Pearl, The Dream of the Rood, but you need to, I'd say, get a head start on Chaucer. Also get a head start on Shakespeare. Now, we didn't start reading Shakespeare until our 3rd year. I don't advise that. I advise you get started on Shakespeare right away and you start digging into him. However long it takes you to read the complete works of Shakespeare, you're going to do that in your 3rd year if you're following the Oxford syllabus anyway, but basically just portioning it out. An ambitious plan would be a play a week, less ambitious a play a month, and I'd say start from the beginning, read him chronologically, because then you're going to see his development, his rise, and you're going to see his influences. You're going to see how he responds to Marlowe and Kidd, and how he basically starts creating the human. But he needed Chaucer, he needed Ovid, he needed Holinshed's history in order to do that. So get started on Chaucer. Where's the best way to start with Chaucer? Once you've got yourself the Riverside Chaucer, you're going to be making notes, go find yourself some recordings of what it sounds like. There's some really good recordings on YouTube. A user called Peter Robinson, he's uploaded, I think, a master's student doing the sort of the performative Chaucer, and that is where you're going to understand Chaucer, because sound conveys meaning and sense, and seeing the hand movements makes it a lot easier to understand. If you see it on the page, it almost looks like a different language. Not quite as bad as Anglo-Saxon, which is basically a different language, very close to Icelandic. But Chaucer's English, it only takes a little bit of getting used to. And what I would do is I would read a bit of Chaucer, listening to the tape, and I would read a bit of Chaucer every week. Now, obviously, there's not that many good readings of Chaucer. I'm actually thinking of doing my own audiobook of Chaucer in the original Middle English. This is hard to find. Most people want to translate Chaucer into modern English. Don't bother with those. Listen to actual authentic recordings and do a bit of Chaucer every week. So one week you might look at the prologue to the Canterbury Tales, listening, even trying to read it out loud, feel it in your mouth. Chaucer's very musical. He has a real vitality to him, just like Shakespeare. Do the Canterbury Tales prologue one week, and then the next week just go through the tales and pick some of the best ranked ones. We can talk about what those are, but to get you started, there's the Wife of Bath, her prologue and tale. You might want to look at the Miller's Tale, the Pardoner's Tale, the Knight's Tale. Go through and do a little bit of Chaucer every week. Also, make sure that you learn anything that you need to know about the old English culture. Okay, email your tutor. And my tutor at Oxford, she was one of the world's sort of eminent scholars and authorities on Chaucer. It's a shame she didn't like me. She hated me. She seemed to have some sort of vendetta out against me. But so what I would do is I would email ahead and say, look, if you don't know anything about the history of that time, the period, or the linguistics, ask them where you can find out more. Say, I need some beginner's texts. They didn't cover this at school. Because I went to a state school, it was a bit different from some of the better schools, where they already had a knowledge of the Anglo-Saxon culture at the time, about epics and, you know, the Battle of Malden, stuff like that. I didn't, so you need to get yourself up to speed. And what I would do is each week, for Old English, I would divide my time into language lessons and history lessons. Per week, I'd probably spend anywhere from an hour and a half to 3 hours just reading about the history of the time. Read about the courtly culture, the sort of the culture of chivalry, King Arthur, all that sort of thing. Read about the kings and queens. Read about how England was divided up at the time. Just learn more about what the situation was, what gave rise to these great works and why they're great. And then I would spend an hour and a half to 3 hours specifically drilling and focusing on language. That means nailing the writing system, the pronunciation, learning it as though it were a language, looking at etymology, feeling it in your mouth, maybe doing your own recordings, listening back, comparing it to another recording of someone who's better, has the pronunciation better, and then correcting yourself. This is how you learn another language. In addition to the Old English language and history lessons, each week I would say focus predominantly on one text, sticking close to the source material and then reading around it, journals, articles, commentaries, introductions and stuff like that. So one week you'll be focusing on Beowulf. Yeah, maybe that'll go into several weeks, but get the J.R.R. Tolkien translation and commentary. Get Seamus Heaney's translation, compare lots of different translations to get a sense, and stay tightly knit to the original and try to possess bits of it by memory. This is how we read poetry. We mull it over, we try and keep it in our brain, and we try to take it around with us in our daily life. And in another week you'll be reading Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Get Simon Armitage's translation, there are many other good ones, and try to understand it in the original too. Other texts that you'll be sticking closely to include Pearl and The Dream of the Rood. There are more different visionary narratives. Pearl is one of the most beautiful poems in the language, although the language is very different from the language today. Try again to possess it by memory. Go over it, get to the heart of it, try and bring your whole soul to it. You need to immerse yourself in this literature. This is also how you read great epics. Epics are the backbone of any serious reading program. We're talking about Milton, Homer, Virgil, and we're talking about poems like Beowulf, yeah? Not just the Iliad and the Odyssey, but things like Beowulf. And the way you go into an epic is, again, bring your whole self to it and relish the difficulty. You're trying to achieve what Harold Bloom calls the Readers Sublime. There is pleasure in difficulty. and try to immerse yourself, try to live in the world, befriend the characters. So you need some solitude, you need some alone time, you need to spend some time not surrounded by students, just trying to absorb yourself in these key texts. 1 per week is perfect, don't get yourself overwhelmed. So that's what I'd be doing for Old English. I would be doing 1 text per week, or focusing 80% of your time on 1 text per week, and then using those texts as a springboard into language study and history study. This is independent of any lectures or tutorials or classes you go to. Try to go to classes around the subject. If there's a class on Old English or a lecture on Old English, go, because those lectures are really valuable. They've done the reading for you over years and they're distilling it into a lecture. So take effective notes, got a video, drop it in the links below, and try to absorb as much as possible. Now I'm going to blend my advice for Victorianism and modern literature together. Basically, I like the approach, like I said before, of having a T-shaped approach, basically knowing some authors better than others, but getting a breadth of everything. So when you're reading, you're going to be looking out, actively seeking for those authors that catch your attention, and you want to be cognizant of why they catch your attention, and use that to learn more about them, go deeper into their works, and springboard to other information that you can scaffold on. So for example, you're reading Oscar Wilde, turn of the century, so he was going to Victorianism. There are many avenues from Oscar Wilde into other avenues of literature, depending on what you enjoy. If you enjoy The Importance of Being Earnest, the play, well, deep dive further into his plays, but that play is very different. It's a bit farcical, but it's very different from, for example, Salome. Salome is more like synesthetic, more overly aesthetic, and it's got its traditional roots. So you're going to figure out, if you like Salome, why you like Salome, and where you can go in 2 directions. 1, deeper into Oscar Wilde's work, and 2, deeper into other writers' work. So fin de siècle time, turn of the century, we're talking about decadent literature. We're going to look into, for example, The Picture of Dorian Gray. And then from The Picture of Dorian Gray, you might think, why do I like The Picture of Dorian Gray? Well, actually, I like the Gothic element. So then you start looking at Gothic as a subject. Maybe you read Dracula. Maybe you keep an eye out for areas that you can go deeper into next year, because the further back into history you go, the more you can explore these roots, like the mystery of Udolpho, Frankenstein, whatever. You're going to try and penetrate and try to learn more about Gothic as the topic. That's just one idea. Or maybe you're interested in science. So in Victorianism, you're reading H.G. Wells. Well, then you're going to want to read more scientific literature. So you're going to want to read Darwin. Now, Darwin's huge. You don't want to read all of Darwin, but you want to isolate parts of Darwin that you might want to read more about. So you're going to have to learn how to read inspectionally. That's basically reading with an aim to discover something. So have a question in your mind, or have an area that you want to pursue knowledge of more, and then you're going to use indexes, commentaries, introductions, contents pages, all that, to find what you want to know about. I think the great tragedy is people will read and love one author, like Charles Dickens, Jane Austen, Anthony Trollope, Thomas Hardy, and they'll only stick to one of their works because they're trying to get a sort of smorgasbord of lots of different things. Your tutors will provide extracts, things to cut out and keep as part of your weekly reading. So you can just read a certain passage, a certain monologue, a certain conversation in a novel, or a certain poem, and that's fine. But you want to do the deeper reading, and the reading that is most meaningful for you. If Dickens excites you, say to yourself, right, what's it going to take to read all of Dickens? And then think about how you might structure a reading program. Do you want to go chronologically? And then as you're reading about Dickens, or reading Dickens, then you want to read around and learn about Dickens's London. And then when you learn about his London, you learn about his literary influences, you learn about the society at the time. You broaden your knowledge by using one author to scaffold out. You're going to learn who he liked. You're going to learn who he influenced. Or maybe you don't go chronologically. Maybe you try to do a reading plan where you read the best first and make it through to the deep cuts, or you invert it and turn it on its head, and you try to read the more niche, the more esoteric choices of Dickens first. Maybe you don't like Dickens. Austen. The great tragedy is people say, I love Austen, I love Pride and Prejudice, and they don't read anything else. You want to read as much Austen as possible. You want to read her juvenilia. If you're doing an English literature program, you have a lot of time to read. Now, an ambitious reading program for someone who's not in university is 1 book per week. So if you're learning English language and literature, you should be reading more than 1 book per week. I'd say you need to read a book, depending on size, every 2 or 3 days. At minimum 2 nice-sized novels per week. That's advice from Jack London. He reads 2 nice-sized novels per week. By the end of your first term, and you're doing Victorians, if you follow that advice, you've read all of Dickens, you know? Or if you follow that advice, you've read basically all of Austen. If you follow that advice, you've read all of anybody, really. You've read a lot of Conrad, yeah? You could read half of Conrad. You could say, right, I'm going to read 2 Conrads a week, and then get to halfway through the term. Okay, 4 or 5 weeks later, you've read about 10 of his books. You've read his letters and correspondences. Then you go, right, Conrad was really interested in this other writer. So I'm going to read some of them, and then I'm going to read someone else, and I'm also interested in someone else. So be ambitious. You want to read as much as you possibly can, to be honest, but I think 1, 2, 3 books per week minimum are very, very achievable. You just need to carve out solitary reading time and bring your whole self to it. You shouldn't read when you're distracted. You shouldn't read when there's a TV on or there's people talking. You go portion out your activities and give your all to each of them. So if you're socialising, you're socialising. If you're watching TV, you're watching TV. But really, when you're reading, you should be reading. And the way you read big books, for example, like Moby Dick, How Do You Swallow the White Whale? Page a day. That will get you through it in term time almost, or if you read a chapter or 2 per day. It's not that difficult to do. So portion out your reading. Maybe you want to read, you have sort of these unmovable commandments where, barring emergencies, you don't waver from your commitments. For example, you might say, I'm going to read 30 minutes, non-negotiable, first thing in the morning with my coffee, regardless. And 5 days out of the week, I'm going to read regardless, unnegotiable, 30 minutes, 40 minutes before bed. And then you also, on top of that, those are you don't move from those. You also portion off and flesh out reading blocks when you can during the day. And this is targeted reading because you're going to be aiming to do an essay on a subject. But long blocks, so you can do deep work. Reading, when done correctly, is work. Read with a pen, read upright in your chair, well lit. Okay, this is not relaxation. This is, increasing mental fortitude, increasing your powers of creativity and rhetoric. This is deep, hard, difficult work. So in addition to a couple of novels per week, I would also ensure that I was reading at least 4 or 5 short stories per week. Some people would say, ambitious people, read a short story a day. And I've done that before, but that doesn't leave rereading open to you. Now, if we were counting rereading, then sure, read a short story a day. But you might read a short story by, Robert Louis Stevenson, or Arthur Conan Doyle. And then you want to reread it a couple of days later. And then a couple of days later, with a pen and seeing stuff that you haven't seen before. Good modern short story, Shirley Jackson's The Lottery, D.H. Lawrence's The Rocking Horse Winner. These are stories that you want to reread many times over to unpick how they've created the effect that they've created. Okay, how did Shirley Jackson create such dystopian horror in The Lottery? How did D.H. Lawrence create such a sense of foreboding in The Rocking Horse Winner? How does Dennis Johnson, in his Emergency, how does he create a sense of dark or black humour? And rereadings will reveal this to you, and you'll start to possess whole chunks of prose by memory, in addition to the poems. Poems, read as much poetry as you possibly can. Minimum a poem a day, but if it was me, I'll be reading more than 1 poem a day, and I'll be rereading my poems over and over again, trying to possess them by memory. And then in addition to all this, I'd be reading journals, I'd be reading commentaries, I'd be reading non-fiction, I'd be reading historical stuff around the topic. If this sounds like a lot of reading, it really is. And my number one regret with university is that I didn't do the deep reading. This sounds extreme, but you can read 9-10 hours a day. You can. If you summon your passion for it and your love, you can read 9-10 hours a day, if you have the time. Obviously now, some days you won't be able to do that, but some days you can have a whole big old reading day where you just get immersed in a couple of books and know them really, really well. So who would I read? Okay, I'm studying the Victorians, and I'm just basing this on sort of my regret of what I didn't do. I would read Hardy properly. Now, I did take an interest in Hardy. I sped read a few of his books, and that wasn't good enough. My regret was that I didn't take my time to really appreciate Hardy and sort of unpick him. Another regret is that I didn't read his poems as deeply as I should have. If you like somebody's poetry and you find they're a novelist, read their novels. If you like someone's novels and you find that they're a poet, read their poetry. This broadens your understanding of them as the artist. And I'm also a bit disappointed that I didn't read more Dickens. I'm disappointed I didn't read more Oscar Wilde. I'm disappointed that I didn't read more George Eliot. So how would I structure my Victorians? I'd read a good few of Dickens's books, and with an aim to reread them. I would read maybe 5 books by Dickens. I would read 3, 4, 5 books by Thomas Hardy. I would read as much as I could of Oscar Wilde. I would read Wilkie Collins, Emily Bronte. I'd read H.G. Wells and Robert Louis Stevenson. Let's talk about Victorian poets. I fell in love with Robert Browning, and I would read him as though I were reading a modern poet. So what happens when the new Simon Armitage volume comes out? You don't really read Simon Armitage in anthology because he's still writing today. You read his latest book of poems. And I would try and do the same for Robert Browning, indeed any poet that I enjoy. I would try and get in the headspace of readers at that time. So get a volume of his poems, like Men and Women, 1855 I believe, and read that. Don't read him in anthology. An anthology of Robert Browning, maybe it mixes some of his wife's work in Elizabeth Barrett Browning. You'd have My Last Duchess, Porphyria's Lover. Good stuff, but read his volumes as though you were reading them for the first time and you were part of the reading public. This is kind of like, like when you get a new record and you listen to it all the way through, you don't want to read like the best of. Best ofs are fine, but it's not the same thing. And also I would read a poet's most challenging works. For Robert Browning, that would be The Ring and the Book, or Pauline, these long sort of epic poems, and really go into solitude and try to unpick why they're so important. Read them out loud. Try to find readings where someone else is reading them out loud. Discuss them. I would also get on board with Tennyson. I didn't like Tennyson back in university, but since then I have fallen in love with much of his work, particularly Ulysses. So, I mean, he was the poet laureate. So try and figure out why was he poet laureate and try to possess him by memory. Let's talk about modern literature. Modern literature around the turn of the century obviously blends a little bit into Victorianism. I mean, you've got H.G. Wells, you've got, who else you got? You've got Joseph Conrad, who I fell in love with. I would still deep dive into Conrad, but I'd bring myself more fully to him. I remember reading Heart of Darkness in one sitting whilst listening to some Beethoven. It was a great memory. Still, I would read Lord Jim. I would read The Secret Sharer, The Secret Agent, Under Western Eyes. I would read all of that stuff. I would make sure, so when I'm reading one book per week in Victorianism, I would try to read all sort of like big names with a view to then expand upon them. For example, reading Graham Greene's Brighton Rock. If I were to like that, I would read 2 more by Graham Greene immediately, and I would try to pick them wisely. I would learn about all the different books, when he wrote them in his career, what the climate was at the time, and I would read them, okay? I do the same for Joyce, Huxley, Orwell, Faulkner, Hemingway, whatever. You want to sort of go deep cuts. So I've said those names, I've thrown them out. Immediately, some titles have already come to your mind. If I say Orwell, if I say Joyce, who else did I say? If I say Huxley, you are thinking of particular novels. Sure, read those and try to understand why they came to your mind first. But then go to a novel by one of those people, one of those writers, that didn't come to your mind, first of all. Okay? And then you'll really start to understand them. Then you'll really start to get under the skin of the century and the sort of different aesthetic theories and stuff like that. Same thing for like William Golding. Everybody thinks Lord of the Flies, right? William Golding. But I would say go get 3 more of Golding's books. If you liked Lord of the Flies, go get 3 more, ones that didn't come to mind immediately. By the way, if you watched this far into the video and you're finding this interesting, let me know whose books you like, and I'll recommend you more obscure places for you to deep dive and more niche books. So put them in the comments below and I'll be more than happy to help you with that. And so that's how I would approach my first year English language and literature, specifically with a view for the syllabus that we followed when I was at Oxford. If you'd like to see a part 2, if you'd like to see me do second term or first year English university, then please leave a comment below and please like this video and subscribe because that will tell me to keep going. Thank you very much for watching. Have a lovely day.